Hello dear learners and welcome to this session. This session will be discussing the second block of the course Disability, Society and Culture, BMDG 171, which is one of the interdisciplinary elective courses in the FYUP, 4-year undergraduate program. So we'll be discussing the second block, which is titled Disability, Social and Cultural Dimensions. Now this block has 4 units: disability through history, representations in religion, mythology and folklore, disability in literature and life narratives, and disability in arts and cinema. Let's talk about some of the major themes in this block today. So firstly, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that disability is not just a medical condition, but it is also deeply rooted in social and cultural thoughts, ideas, and processes. So it has social and cultural dimensions because the way in which persons with disability are treated, considered, regarded is deeply connected with our social norms, values, attitudes, and so on. So we notice that throughout history, persons with disabilities have usually been regarded and treated in a rather different way than non-disabled persons. Sometimes they're considered as a burden to society. They may be considered as not fit to be alive, and a number of very, very problematic or some very, very brutal social processes have been seen, particularly in ancient societies, wherein persons with disabilities were treated very, very poorly and very often even exterminated or left to die. So we'll be looking at some of these historical examples, and we'll also be seeing how over history the perception and understanding of disability changes. And because disability is something that is so deeply connected with our social and cultural values, it is important to have a look at these cultural values and see how they reflect in various dimensions of society and culture. We discussed the social structures and institutions which have excluded and not given access or marginalized persons with disability across societies. And we also look at the cultural representations through myths, folklore, literature, cinema, etc. So with this introduction in mind, let us go on to discuss some of the important themes that we have discussed in this block. So like we've mentioned, if we look at disability through history, we find that perspectives in different historical phases have differed and changed. So, as scholars say, disability is an evolving category. Throughout the ages, we have seen that persons with disabilities have been the subject of fear, prejudices, and intolerance. And even though in the contemporary times there is a much more inclusive attitude towards persons with disabilities, some of these fears, some of these prejudices, some of these misunderstandings and misconceptions continue to persist. And much of this can be addressed if we look at the way in which we represent persons with disabilities, the way we talk about them, the way we write about them. If we very, very consciously and critically think about these things, then the perception of persons with disabilities can be changed. So if we look at some historical examples, we find that in ancient or classical Rome and Greece, physically deformed children or babies were often abandoned. They were left to die because they were considered as a curse from the gods, or they were considered an economic burden who could not be borne by the society. And therefore, there are instances throughout history of the abandonment and killing of children who are born either with some kind of deformity or disability. Let's now move to medieval Europe. Medieval Europe in the Middle Ages, from around 500 CE to 1500 CE, is a time or a historical period which was marked by many wars, conflicts, and a number of epidemics also. And these invariably resulted in a lot of people falling victim to epidemics, plagues, various kinds of diseases, and various kinds of disabling conditions. We find that begging was a very, very common phenomenon. Persons with disabilities really had no other option but to beg for their living. We also find in some cases that persons with disabilities were considered as objects of ridicule or objects of entertainment. So in many of the courts or in many of the kingly, courts, you found that persons with disabilities were employed to entertain the audience, to make people laugh. They were treated as jesters. They were treated as freaks who were there for people to laugh at. So basically, their treatment was in a rather inhuman or a way in which that really did not fully recognize their humanity. We also find that persons with intellectual disability, what we commonly know as mental retardation, but this term is no longer used because it is considered as a derogatory term. So persons with mental limitations who had difficulty in learning or who had different kinds of weaknesses were considered subhuman. They were not considered, human in the fullest sense. But then on the other side, they were also sometimes considered as divine innocents. It was believed that because they were not clever, because they were not cunning, because they did not have the capacity to cheat or to lie, or so it was believed, they were closer to God than ordinary mortals. So this notion of the divine innocent was also quite well entrenched at that time. And we find that even till this day, a lot of persons who have got intellectual disabilities are infantilized. They are seen as children. They are not seen as having full adult capacities, which is quite, which has been challenged. And, it is no longer considered appropriate to view them as children because they also have the same desires and aspirations as adults do. We find at the time that a number of these social attitudes in European society at the time were shaped by the dominant religion, which was Christianity. And disability and disease were in a way seen as God's way of testing people. It was like a test or, a kind of a way in which the divine powers took a test of people's faith. And these were also seen as opportunities for charitable works. So the religious understanding around disability at that time, which then impacted the way in which persons with disability were treated, was that it was in a sense a test from God, a divine kind of a punishment or an opportunity for people to earn redemption or to earn salvation through performing good deeds. A very important period in the history of Europe is what we call the Renaissance, and later the Enlightenment. These two periods in European history, in a sense, were marked by a move away from religious to more secular ways of thinking, in which art, literature, science all flourished. So this period was, in a sense, a kind of a golden age in the history of Europe, roughly from the 15th to the 18th century. And it was in this period of time that human beings laid a lot of emphasis on bodily perfection, on the ability to think, on the ability to reason. And therefore, anyone who deviated from this ideal, or persons with disabilities whose bodies or whose way of thinking, whose intellect was not considered to be perfect, they were therefore not seen in a very positive light. They were seen as helpless or hopeless, unfit, as failures, and it was considered that they would be in constant need of care and support. So even though at this time the notion of the human being as someone who is self-driven, the notion of art, the notion of science, all these really flourished, but attitudes towards persons with disabilities continued to lag behind. And we also find that persons with disabilities tended to be confined or to be put away in asylums or in homes. This was considered a way of, or a method of social control, wherein they were taken away from the mainstream of society and dealt with in separate institutions and facilities. And you will notice, dear learners, that this is very, very different from the way persons with disabilities are treated in countries like India and non-Western countries, where they are invariably in the care or in the custody of the family. So it is the family and the community that has always played a very, very important role in the care of persons with disability in non-Western societies. And we'll talk a little more about this in a bit. We also find that the growth of science and medicine had a profound impact on persons with disabilities. So around the 18th century, we get the notion of the normal, what is normal, and this comes from the discipline of statistics. So then there started to be these ideas about what is normal growth, normal development, and normal and abnormal then became categories of judging or evaluating human development and capacities. So rather than allowing human beings to develop at their own rate, at their own pace, certain ideas about what is normal development, what are normal milestones, etc., came into existence, and therefore a lot of scrutiny of people who are not developing in the normal or the way in which they were expected to develop. Now, learners, let's talk about a very, very important historical development, which initially began in Europe and then influenced the entire world. That is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution is a very, very important moment in human history because the way in which production or the way in which the economy functions moved from an agrarian kind of a structure or from farm-based economy to an industrial economy or the industrial system where factories were really producing or mass producing goods. And this kind of huge change in the economy also reflected in many, many profound changes in society. So from a rural economy, big cities, big towns started growing. Migration from the countryside to the growing towns and cities became a part of life. And the kind of community life that existed in the smaller agricultural communities completely changed, because here people were living in cities where there was a lot of anonymity, people did not know each other. The basic function that they had to perform was work. The living conditions and the working conditions in many cases were absolutely terrible. So they had a lot of exposure to very harmful working situations and so on. So it is basically what we call the labor economy, wherein there was a need for workers to be able to work in factories and produce wealth for the industrialists. So who were these workers? These workers had to be persons who were able to perform hard labor. So persons who had any kind of disabilities or any kind of illnesses were considered unproductive. They were not considered to have any value or of any use in this industrial system. And therefore, in this period, we find that persons who were unable to work, who were considered unproductive, who were considered as burdens to society, were also put away in institutions or in asylums in the case of those who had mental issues or mental health issues, because they were not considered part of this industrial economy. They were not considered productive agents of the industrial economy. One of the important and very, very problematic ideas that grew around this time was the notion of eugenics. So eugenics basically refers to an ideology wherein it is believed that there is only a certain section of society which really deserves to reproduce or procreate so that they can make society prosperous. So who are these people? The rich, those who come from upper socioeconomic strata, they were believed in industrial society to be more intelligent, more worthy as citizens than those who came from poverty, those who came from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So it was a very, and interestingly enough, this kind of idea of eugenics was picked up or was promoted or was supported by many intellectuals, scientists, lawyers, industrialists. In other words, the elite society really was in favor of this notion of eugenics. Now, naturally, who do you think were the people who they did not consider fit to live in society? Naturally, those who had disabilities, those who had illnesses, those who were considered as weak. And we find that in many cases, laws came into being to sterilize persons who had intellectual disabilities. And it was considered that allowing these people to reproduce, allowing people with these conditions to reproduce, would lead to a society that was full of weak people and unproductive people. So, of course, this whole notion of eugenics has been completely discredited over the years, but unfortunately, we still do find some reflections of it in certain pockets of society, wherein persons with disabilities are not considered as fit to live. And we often also see it in, things like fetal or abortion of fetuses who are found to have disabilities and so on. So it has its hangover. It is continuing to manifest itself in many subtle ways. However, eugenics as an ideology has been completely discredited. And one of the most terrible impacts of this kind of thinking about which people are fit to live, which people do not deserve to live, and so on, was seen in Nazi Germany. In the early 1940s, people with physical and mental disabilities were mercilessly exterminated by the Nazis. In fact, it is estimated that around 300,000 persons with disabilities were killed, or there was mass killing of these individuals. And this is, as you can very well understand, a huge blot on the history of humanity or of humankind. Another very, very significant historical development was the impact of the two world wars. So as you are probably aware, the world wars really, which took place in the 20th century, World War I was between 1914 and 1918, and World War II was between 1939 and 1945, in which practically the whole world was involved in these wars, even though it was the colonial powers who were at war with each other. But by default, many of their colonies, including India, were sucked into this cycle of conflict. And these two world wars resulted in enormous losses of life, injuries, and disabilities. You are aware that in 1945, World War II ended with the atomic explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the impact of nuclear warfare has had a profound impact on persons with disability in terms of, causing grievous injuries and disabilities, and in fact even causing genetic mutations which carried on over the generations. We find that because of this tremendous amount of loss of life, injuries, and disabling injuries, disabled war veterans and civilians who became victims in these huge conflicts needed to be rehabilitated. They needed to be given vocational training in order that they could conduct their lives, once again, in order that they could become independent. And it was at this time, in this period, coinciding with and after the world wars, that many organizations and charities came up to address the needs of the war veterans. However, unfortunately, many of the civilians who were disabled by the war and conflict tended to be left out. Many of them did not get the kind of rehabilitation that they required. And in the post-World War period, we find that in the 1960s and 70s, persons with disabilities slowly started coming together to demand their rights, to demand that their needs and their requirements be addressed, and that they should be given, or they should be included and permitted to participate in society as full citizens, rather than being just the recipients of charity and welfare. So we'll talk about the growth of the disability rights movements and disability rights movements across the world in a subsequent program. But here, the idea was just to give you a sense that historical developments have profoundly influenced the way in which disability is thought about and the way in which disability is addressed. So when we look at the Indian context, as I've earlier mentioned, unlike the West, where institutionalization or sending persons with disabilities to institutions was a very, a common phenomenon, we find that in the Indian context, family care or care of persons with disabilities within the community was really the norm. Now, all of us know that India is a deeply religious society, and here the concept of karma, or compensation for past deeds, deeply influences the thinking on disability. Now, some people have critiqued this idea that, the notion of karma makes people passive towards disability. But on the other hand, other scholars have also said that this also helps us or helps persons to accept disability not as something terrible, but as something that is a part of life and has to be handled in a spirit of acceptance and equanimity. We find that our sacred texts and our great epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana continue to this day to provide ethical guidelines and influence our thought and action. And both these epics have a number of characters with disabilities. We will not discuss it right now due to paucity of time, but you yourself would be familiar with some of these characters and the way they have been portrayed. So some scholars have critiqued this portrayal, saying that characters with disability are in a sense shown exclusively in a negative light, but others have also tried to show them in an empathetic reading. So reading or understanding how persons with disabilities have been portrayed in the epics gives us a good way of understanding the social attitudes towards them. And like we've mentioned, the role of the family in the care of their disabled members has always been very, very crucial, and particularly the role of women and girls in the family, who are the unpaid caregivers, who are the permanent caregivers, who really do not receive credit for the work that they do, but nevertheless, they perform a huge role and function in the care of persons with disabilities. We also find, if we look at the historical context, that community care of persons with disabilities was quite widely seen. So persons with disabilities may have resorted to begging as a means of survival, and persons would give charity. Those who are rich or those who are well-to-do, feeding the poor and disabled was seen as a charitable act, which was performed by wealthy and powerful people and kings. So there are evidences of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century CE, who was believed to have established care homes and hospitals for persons with disability and persons who were sick. And scholars also write about the Mughal emperors, for instance, Emperor Jahangir, who would distribute large sums of money to the physically impaired, blind, or disfigured persons. Let's come now quickly to the colonial period, to British India. So this actually saw a huge number of changes with regard to the way in which persons with disabilities were treated. So in the colonial period, the hospital system, so, the medical, the colonial medicine was a very, very important area which a lot of historians have studied in detail. So the establishment of hospitals, schools, training centers, asylums took place in a large way during the British period. And the role of the missionaries also was very, very important. And they actually set up many formal schools for children with disabilities. So the first residential school for blind children was set up in 1887 at Amritsar in Punjab. And the first residential school for the deaf was set up in 1884 at Mazgaon in the then Bombay Presidency. In the post-independence period, and this also is something that we will cover in detail in subsequent sessions, we find that, like in the West, persons with disabilities in India in the post-independence period also started advocating for their rights. Because after India gained independence, there were a number of social movements. There were movements against the various forms of social injustices like caste, gender, environmental movements, and so on. So disability rights movements also emerged in the 70s and 80s, and persons who are visually impaired had a very, very major role to play. So the National Federation for the Blind is one of the leading organizations, is one of the early organizations that was a self-advocacy organization for persons with disabilities. Also legislations and social policy, including the ratification of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which India was amongst the first signatories to this very, very important human rights declaration. And currently, our law, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 2016, is one of the very, very important rights-based legislation, which looks at persons with disabilities not as recipients of charity, but as bearers or holders of rights who are entitled to the same rights as any other citizen. So very quickly, let's look at some of the cultural dimensions. How does culture, how do cultural attitudes, values, and beliefs influence the way we deal with disability? So we've already mentioned the idea of karma, the notion of charity, of dhan, of seva. These are all cultural values that influence our treatment or our understanding of disability. There are many myths and stories, as we've also mentioned, maybe representation of disability as a punishment. It has negative, depictions as well as sympathetic treatment. There is a rich body of folklore, proverbs, and sayings. So I'm sure all of you in your regional languages would be having many, many proverbs which deal with disabling conditions, which deal with deafness, visual impairment, and so on, and actually understanding and, trying to unpack what these proverbs are trying to say gives us a very, very good understanding of how disability is perceived in society. And it would be an interesting exercise for you to note down or jot down some of the proverbs, the sayings, the folk stories, etc. in your native languages so that you can understand the concept of disability and culture better. We also find the way that which literature depicts disability. So through history, there have been a number of very, very famous writers, very, very famous authors with disability. In English literature, those of you who are students of English literature would be aware of Milton, who was blind, and so many other authors and poets who had various kinds of disabilities. In the Indian context, Surdas, the poetry of Surdas, is considered something which is very, very well known and well regarded, and Surdas was visually impaired. So in every culture, we have writings, we have expressions by persons with disabilities. And there's also a lot of life writing that has come up. Persons with disabilities writing their autobiographies or writing biographies, actually depicting the experiences that they have gone through in their lives and helping us get a better understanding of how disability is experienced by disabled persons themselves. So these are very, very important documents, very, very important sources that students of disability studies must engage with. And lastly, mass media and cinema. So Indian cinema, we will have a separate session on this. But just to give you an indicator, mass media and cinema has such a huge impact on the way we think about different issues, including disability. So how are disabilities represented in the mass media? How do films represent persons with disabilities? Are they basically stereotypes? Do they concentrate on happy endings? Do they actually bring realistic images of persons with disability to the audience? These are all subjects of discussion and that you need to think about and reflect upon. And most importantly, do they actually represent the voices and experiences of persons with disabilities? So, dear learners, to conclude, we see that disability has social and cultural dimensions which need to be studied. A study of disability history helps us to understand the way in which persons with disabilities have been treated through the length and breadth of history and through cultures, and how cultural values and beliefs, studying these is very important to understand how society views and treats persons with disabilities. Thank you for your patient listening.